Welcome to Empires by Candlelight. Tonight, we travel to a place where the largest religious monument ever built by human beings still stands, silent, in the middle of a dry forest. A place where, 800 years ago, a city of nearly 1 million people drew its water from reservoirs the size of small seas. A place that the world, for almost 400 years, simply forgot was there. Imagine an empire whose temples were carved with 800 meters of stone scripture. Imagine an empire whose engineers moved enough water every year to rival a small ocean. Imagine an empire whose king carved his own smiling face onto 216 stone towers so that whichever direction you walked, he was watching you with the gentle compassion of a Buddha. And then imagine that empire vanished from the map of empires so completely that, for centuries, most of its own descendants believed the temples had been built by gods. Tonight, we journey to the Khmer Empire. This is the full story. Not a chapter, not a fragment, but the whole long arc of it, from a Persian merchant's dock on the Mekong Delta in the year 200, all the way to a French naturalist stumbling into the moat of Angkor Wat 18 centuries later. It will take us about 2 hours to tell. Before we begin, if these long, quiet stories help you towards sleep, gently tap like and subscribe, and drop a comment with where in the world you are listening from tonight. I love to see the lamps still on. And now, settle in. Pull a blanket up around your shoulders. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Tonight, we go where the jungle has been patient for 600 years. To understand how the Khmer Empire was born, you have to understand the river it grew next to. The Mekong is one of the great rivers of the world. It rises on the eastern edge of the Tibetan Plateau, 1,200 kilometers west of Beijing, and flows south for 4,500 kilometers through China, Burma, Laos, Thailand, and Cambodia, before fragmenting into a vast 9-channel delta in southern Vietnam and emptying into the South China Sea. In the first centuries of our era, when Rome was still standing, when the Han Dynasty still ruled China, when the Silk Road was just being charted across Central Asia, that delta was the busiest place in mainland Southeast Asia. You are standing on a wooden dock at the port of Okio, somewhere near the year 200 of our era. The afternoon is hot. The air smells of salt and fermented fish sauce and wood smoke. A long, proud merchant junk is just tying up at the next dock over, its crew shouting in 3 languages at once. Beside you, a Persian merchant in a long indigo robe is unloading bolts of crimson silk from his cargo hold, watched closely by a Funan customs officer who is making detailed notes on a palm leaf manifest. Behind the Persian, an Indian Brahmin priest in white cotton, newly arrived from the southern Indian port of Muziris, is supervising the careful unloading of a small wooden crate. Inside the crate are 6 palm leaf manuscripts. They are books of Hindu scripture, hand-copied by his fellow Brahmins in the holy city of Kanchipuram. He has carried them with extraordinary care for 6 months across the Indian Ocean. They are a personal gift to the king of Funan. 3 steps away, on a wooden stall covered with rough red linen, a Funan merchant is offering for sale, for the equivalent of 3 months' wages, a small gold medallion that he claims accurately was struck in the year 180 in the imperial mint of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius in Rome. This is Ak-Io in the year 200. It is one of the busiest international ports on Earth, and almost no one in the modern world knows it existed. The kingdom that controls Ak-Io is called Funan. We know almost nothing about Funan from its own records, because almost no Funan records survive. Everything we know comes from 3 sources: the brief mentions in Chinese imperial chronicles, the slightly longer descriptions left by Chinese envoys who visited the kingdom in the 3rd century, and the increasingly rich archaeological excavations that French and Vietnamese teams have been conducting at Ak-Io since the 1940s. What we know is this: Funan is a maritime trading empire. It controls the southern delta of the Mekong and the lower stretches of the river itself. It controls the trade routes that link India and the Mediterranean, running through the Persian Gulf, around southern India, across the Bay of Bengal, around the Malay Peninsula, to the trade routes of southern China. Funan exports rice. The rich black soil paddies of the delta produce 3 harvests a year, more than the kingdom can possibly consume. It exports aromatic woods, sandalwood, agarwood, frankincense, and benzoin, gathered from the highland forests of the interior. It exports gold, mined in small alluvial deposits in what is today southern Vietnam. It exports tin, ivory, and rare medicinal herbs. What it imports, what makes OCEO the rich city it is everything else. Persian wine arrives in Okyo in clay amphorae shipped via Indian middlemen. Roman gold coins, Persian silver, Indian glass, Egyptian linen, Chinese silk and lacquerware, which Funan re-exports to the west. Tibetan musk, Indian peppercorns, Greek bronze statues. Occasionally, when a trader can persuade a Mediterranean shipper to risk the long voyage east, the Funan kings grow rich on the customs duties. By the year 300, the kingdom is one of the most prosperous in the world, and it is, by that point, also one of the most Indianized. The Indianization of Funan is not a conquest. It is one of the strangest and most peaceful cultural transmissions in human history. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, Indian merchants and Brahmin priests begin traveling east along the maritime spice routes. They come, originally, as guests of the Funan court. The Funan kings, who control a wealthy but technologically simple society, want what the Indians have. The Brahmin priests bring 3 things the Funan kings cannot get any other way. The first is writing. Funan, before the Indian contact, has no script of its own. The Funan court conducts its business orally. There are no permanent records. There are no inscribed treaties. There are no genealogies that survive more than 3 generations. The Brahmins bring with them a script, derived from the Brahmi alphabet of southern India, that can record any sound the human voice can make. They bring Sanskrit, the literary language of the Indian court tradition. Within 2 generations, the Funan kings are inscribing their genealogies on stone stelae in Sanskrit verse, in a script that, 1800 years later, modern Khmer scholars can still read. The second thing the Brahmins bring is law. They bring the elaborate Indian political philosophy of kingship, codified in Sanskrit texts like the Arthashastra of the political philosopher Kautilya and the Manava Dharma Shastra of the lawgiver Manu. These texts answer in remarkable practical detail every question a medieval king might face: how to assess taxes, how to organize an army, how to choose ministers, how to draft a treaty, how to put down a rebellion, how to perform the rituals that, in the eyes of his subjects, confirm his right to rule. For a Funan king, these texts are a complete administrative manual. The third thing the Brahmins bring is the most important of all. They bring the religious idea of the Devaraja. A Devaraja is not a king. A Devaraja is the human face of a Hindu god on earth. When you bow to a Devaraja, you are not bowing to a man. You are bowing to Shiva, or to Vishnu, or to the great mother goddess Devi. When the Devaraja gives an order, the order is not coming from a court. It is coming from the cosmos. When the Devaraja dies, he does not simply die. He merges with the God to whom he has dedicated his life. He becomes, in some literal theological sense, immortal. This is a politically explosive idea. It elevates the king from a tribal leader, first among equal warriors, to a cosmic figure. It places his subjects in a religious obligation, not merely a political one. It embeds the entire apparatus of the state, its rituals, its temples, its taxes, its armies, inside a sacred grammar that the Brahmin priests can supply and maintain. The Funan kings adopt the Devaraja idea eagerly. By the year 400, every Funan king is, in the formal court theology, a living incarnation of either Shiva or Vishnu. Every Funan royal anointment is conducted in Sanskrit verse by an imported Indian Brahmin. Every Funan official document carries the formula Bhagavata Padanudiyata, by the grace of the lotus feet of the Lord. The Devaraja idea will last in modified form in Cambodia for 15 centuries. It is still, in a quiet ceremonial way, the theological foundation of the modern Cambodian monarchy today. And then, around the year 500, Funan starts to fail. The signs are gradual. The harbors of Ok Eo silt up. The Mekong is depositing more sediment at its mouth than the ocean tides can clear. The merchant junks begin to bypass the delta entirely, sailing instead through the new maritime entrepot of Srivijaya on the eastern coast of Sumatra. The customs revenue declines. The court loses its outward-facing wealth. Worse, the politics of the court turn quarrelsome. Brothers fight brothers. Cousins fight cousins. Every royal death triggers a succession crisis that weakens the kingdom a little further. By the year 600, Funan has been conquered. The conquerors are an inland kingdom called Chenla, based in the highlands of what is today's southern Laos and northern Cambodia. They are not a maritime people. They are warriors and rice farmers. Their kings do not wear silk. Their gods, however, are the same Hindu gods, Shiva, Vishnu, Devi, that Funan worshipped. For about 150 years, Chenla rules the lands of the former Funan. The Hindu kingship survives. The Sanskrit inscriptions continue. The Brahmin priests continue to anoint the new kings in the old Devaraja ritual. But the center of gravity has shifted. The empire is no longer about ocean trade. It is about rice, about irrigation, about the inland alluvial plains that surround the great lake of the Tonle Sap. And then, in the way of inland kingdoms, Chenla fractures. Around the year 700, the Chinese imperial chronicles report, somewhat casually, that Chenla has split in two. The Chinese call them Land Chenla in the highlands and Water Chenla in the delta. Each claims to be the true heir of Funan. Each sends rival embassies to the Tang court. Each fights small inconclusive wars against the other. The two halves quarrel. Neither half is strong enough to win. For 100 years, Cambodia drifts in fragments. And then, a young prince comes home from Java. His name is Jayavarman II. We know almost nothing about his early life. His parentage is uncertain. He was probably the son of a minor Water Chenla king, but the surviving inscriptions name 3 different possible mothers, all of them members of the senior royal household with strong genealogical claims of their own. He was born, probably, around the year 770, although the exact date is disputed by every modern historian who has worked on the question. What is certain is that sometime in his early adolescence, perhaps when he was 12 or 13 years old, he was sent away. The Sailendra dynasty, on the central plain of Java, was at that moment the rising maritime power of insular Southeast Asia. The Sailendras controlled the spice trade, the maritime routes between India and China, and a small empire of vassal kingdoms across the Indonesian archipelago. They had the wealth and the naval power to extract tribute from the fragmented kingdoms of mainland Southeast Asia. They demanded, among other things, hostages. Young princes from the small vassal kingdoms were sent to the Sailendra court at Yogyakarta, not as prisoners exactly, but as long-term diplomatic guests. They were educated in the Sailendra court. They were trained in Sanskrit, in Sailendra court ritual, in the elaborate maritime politics of the Indonesian archipelago. They lived, for years or decades at a time, inside the most cosmopolitan court in 8th century Asia, and in the formal politics of the era, they remained at the Sailendra court as long as their home kingdoms continued to pay tribute. If a home kingdom rebelled or fell behind on its tribute, the Sailendras held the hostage prince as leverage. If the situation got bad enough, the hostage could even be sent home with a Sailendra army at his back to replace the rebelling king. This is the world that the young Jayavarman grows up in. He spends, by the modern best estimates, somewhere between 15 and 25 years at the Sailendra court. He learns Sanskrit. He learns the political philosophy of Devaraja kingship. He learns the latest fashions in temple architecture. He watches, almost certainly, the construction of the colossal stone monument of Borobudur on the volcanic plain south of Yogyakarta. the largest Buddhist temple ever built, finished around the year 800, just as Jayavarman is preparing to return home, and he becomes, by the time he is in his late 20s or early 30s, a different kind of prince than the petty quarreling kings of the fragmented Chenla. He has a vision. He believes that Cambodia is one country, not two. He believes it should have a single king, not two warring rivals. He believes, most importantly, that the king's authority should come not from the Sailendras, not from any foreign court, but directly from the Hindu cosmos itself. In the year 800, or thereabouts, the date is uncertain, he returns home, and on a sandstone mountain called Mahendra Parvata, 4 years later, in the cool air of the Kulin Plateau, he is going to do something no Khmer king has ever done before. The Kulin Plateau, in the year 802, is one of the most beautiful and least visited places in mainland Southeast Asia. It rises about 400 meters above the surrounding rice plains, a long rolling sandstone tableland 30 kilometers long, covered with thick dipterocarp forest and threaded by small spring-fed streams. The local Khmer call it Panam Kulin, the mountain of the lychee trees, and they regard it, with good reason, as a holy place. What makes the Kulin Plateau holy is geology. It is the source of all the water that flows into the future Angkor Plain below. The 4 small rivers that will, 2 generations later, water Yasovarman's great capital, the Siem Reap, the Roluos, the Stung Ki Krang, the Stung Pu, all rise in springs on the southern slope of the Kulin Plateau. To control the Kulin is to control, in a precise hydraulic sense, the future agricultural heartland of the Khmer Empire. Jayavarman has chosen his coronation site with extraordinary care. He arrives at the foot of the Kulin Plateau in the dry season of 802, with a small retinue of regional vassal lords, 2 royal scribes, and a single Brahman priest. The priest's name is recorded 2 centuries later in the great Stokak Tom inscription. He is called Hiranyadama. Hiranyadama is a recent arrival from India. He has been brought east at great expense specifically for this ceremony. He is, in the surviving records, the senior Brahmin scholar of his generation in Cambodia. He is a master of the elaborate Sanskrit tantric ritual that the young king has decided to perform. The night before the ceremony, the small expedition camps at the foot of the plateau. Sandalwood incense is burned. Sanskrit mantras are recited. The king fasts. At dawn the next morning, the king and the priest begin the climb. The path up the side of the Kulin Plateau is narrow, a series of sandstone steps carved by earlier travelers into the natural rock. The mist hangs thick between the karst peaks of the surrounding mountains. The forest below is silent. By mid-morning, they reach the summit. A small wooden platform has been built the previous week on a bare stone clearing at the highest point of the plateau. Hiranyadama climbs the platform first. He arranges his ritual implements, a bronze water vessel, a small fire altar, a stack of palm leaf manuscripts containing the Sanskrit liturgy. The king climbs the platform after him and kneels. The ritual takes most of the day. It is called in the Sanskrit texts Devarajaya Pratishta, the establishment of God kingship. It is, by Indian standards, an elaborate version of the standard royal anointment. It involves multiple Sanskrit mantras drawn from the Tantric Hindu tradition. It involves the pouring of consecrated water, drawn from 4 directions, 4 cardinal points, 4 rivers, over the king's head. It involves the recitation, in Sanskrit verse, of the long mythological genealogy that connects the king to the gods of the Vishnu Purana. Most importantly, at the very end, it involves a declaration. The declaration is recorded in the Stok Kaktam inscription, carved 2.5 centuries later, in Sanskrit verses that translate, very roughly, as this: "From this day forward, the king is Chakravartin. From this day forward, the king is the wheel-turning monarch. From this day forward, the king owes tribute to no foreign court. From this day forward, the king's authority comes directly from the Lord of the 3 worlds. The Lord of the 3 worlds is Shiva. The foreign court, the one Jayavarman is renouncing, is the Sailendra court of Java. The Chakravartin is the universal monarch, the king of all four cardinal directions, the master of all the lesser kings within his domain. It is, in effect, a declaration of independence. It is the founding moment of the Khmer Empire. The sun is setting as Hiranyadama completes the ritual. The mist has lifted. The dipterocarp forest, far below, glows in the long horizontal golden light of late afternoon. Jayavarman stands on the platform, freshly anointed, water still dripping from his hair, and looks out across the lands that, in the official cosmology he has just adopted, are now his cosmic kingdom. He is 32 years old. He has just declared, on the basis of a Brahmin's Sanskrit mantras and his own audacity, that he is the human face of Shiva on earth. He has no army worth mentioning. He has no capital. He has no treasury. He has no infrastructure. He has only the ritual, the priest, the mountain, and an idea. But the idea, it will turn out, is enough. We have followed the founding ritual on the mountain. We have watched a single Brahmin priest on a single sandstone summit anoint a single young king as the wheel-turning monarch of a country that did not yet quite exist. Now we follow his grandsons. We watch them turn that fragile ritual moment into the most extraordinary hydraulic empire in the history of medieval Asia. To understand why the Khmer needed to build a river, you have to first understand the geography of Cambodia. Cambodia is not, by global standards, a dry country. The annual rainfall in central Cambodia averages around 1,500 millimeters a year, more than London, more than New York, more than most of California or southern France. The total volume of water that falls on the land in a given year is enormous. The problem is, when it falls, the Cambodian climate is divided sharply into two seasons by the rhythm of the monsoon. From May to October, the southwest monsoon blows in from the Indian Ocean, lifted over the wide, warm waters of the Bay of Bengal, dumping the moisture it has accumulated onto the mountains of Southeast Asia. It rains nearly every afternoon in violent vertical sheets. By October, the entire landscape is underwater. Rice fields are flooded. Roads are impassable. The Tonle Sap Lake swells to 5 times its dry season size. The Mekong River, swollen with the meltwater of the eastern Himalaya, combined with the monsoon runoff, flows backwards into the lake, one of the strangest hydrological phenomena on Earth. Then in October, the monsoon withdraws, and for the next 6 months, until April, there is no significant rain at all. The flooded landscape drains, the rice paddies dry, the fields crack, the rivers shrink to muddy trickles. The Tonle Sap Lake contracts back to its small, dry season shape, about 1/5 its wet season size. Temperatures rise into the high 30s Celsius. The dry forest of central Cambodia, the open canopy of dipterocarp trees that surrounds Angkor, drops its leaves, the way temperate forests drop leaves in autumn. But for the opposite reason, conserving moisture in advance of the dry months. For half the year, central Cambodia is drowning. For the other half, it is a near desert. This rhythm is impossible to find, but it can be tamed. And the Khmer kings, beginning in the early 9th century, set themselves to tame it. The first of the great Khmer engineers was a king named Indrivarman I. He was the grandson of Jayavarman II, the Chakravartin who had been crowned on Mahendra Parvata in 802. By the time Indrivarman took the throne, probably in the year 877 of our era, the Chakravartin's loose consolidation of Khmer chiefdoms had hardened, under his immediate successors, into something resembling a functioning state. The capital at this time was at a place called Hadi-Hadalaya, in the rice-rich plains south of the Tonle Sap. The site is now a small village called Rolawos, about 13 kilometers east of modern Siem Reap. In Indrivarman's day, it was Cambodia's first true city. Hariharalaya had stone temples, small ones by the standards of what would come later. It had streets laid out in a rough grid. It had a small palace complex at its center. It had, by the standards of mainland Southeast Asia in the late 9th century, real urban infrastructure. Indrivarman built 3 things in his short reign. He dies, probably in the year 889, after only 12 years on the throne. He builds, first, a state temple called Preah Kor, the sacred bull, dedicated to Shiva. Preah Ko is a small brick temple with 6 step towers arranged in a precise rectangle, 3 on each row. The towers are dedicated in elaborate Sanskrit inscriptions to Jayavarman's deified ancestors, his father, his mother, and his maternal grandparents, each represented as the human face of Shiva on earth. He builds, second, a mountain temple called Bakun, a stepped pyramid in 5 levels, the first Khmer state temple to take the symbolic form of Mount Mera, the cosmic center of the Hindu universe. The Bakun is dedicated to the king's own merged divine self, the form he will assume after death, when he merges with Shiva. But the third project is the most important. Jayavarman builds, just to the east of his capital, the first of the great Khmer reservoirs. The Khmer call it a bere. The word is Sanskrit derived and roughly translates as great water or great reservoir. It is, in essence, a man-made lake, but it is more than that. It is a sacred lake in the Hindu cosmological sense, a recreation in the landscape of the cosmic ocean that surrounds Mount Mero. To bathe in a bere, in the Khmer ritual sense, is to bathe in the cosmic waters of the universe. The Jayavarman Barai at Hariharalaya, also called the Indratadaka, the Lake of Indra, is one of the most important engineering projects in the history of mainland Southeast Asia. It is a rectangular man-made lake, 3.5 kilometers long and 750 meters wide. It holds, when full, more than 10 million cubic meters of water, enough to fill 4,000 Olympic swimming pools. It is, in its time, the largest man-made structure anywhere in the world. How did they build it? The answer is, simply, by digging. But that simple answer hides a remarkable engineering achievement. The Khmer had no metal-bladed shovels. They had no draft animals capable of pulling a plow through hard earth. They had no gunpowder for blasting. What they had was a population of rice farmers who in the dry season had little to do, and a religious system in which donating labor to the king was a way of accumulating spiritual merit. The labor pool at Hariharalaya in the late 9th century was probably in the tens of thousands. They worked with simple bamboo baskets, slung from the ends of poles, carried over the shoulder. They dug into the dry earth in the months between January and April, when the ground was hard and the rains had not yet arrived. They piled the excavated earth on the 4 sides of the rectangle, forming the bunds, the earth embankments that would hold back the monsoon water when it finally came. The work was organized through a system called chetra, a Sanskrit administrative term that loosely translates as the field of corvée. Every Khmer village in the region was assessed an annual labor quota, owed to the king. Each village sent its share of young men every year to whichever public works project the local royal official assigned them. The labor was unpaid in any monetary sense, but it earned the village, in the official theology of the kingdom, both spiritual merit and a kind of tax credit against future demands. It took about 10 years to dig the Indratadaka. When it was finished, when the first monsoon flowed down the intake canal and the great rectangle began to fill, when the first reflection of the rising sun appeared on the still water of the new lake, Jayavarman performed a ritual that would, in modified form, be performed at every Khmer bare for the next 500 years. He had a small stone temple built on a wooden platform out in the center of the bare, on a small island created from a knoll left during the digging. He dedicated the temple to Vishnu. He filled it with offerings of rice and incense, and then, in front of the entire court and an audience of perhaps 100,000 farmers, he stepped into the holy waters of his new cosmic ocean and bathed. The bathing was the point. The Khmer bare was not just an irrigation reservoir. It was a cosmic mirror, a recreation in stone and water of the universe itself. The king, by bathing in it, ritually reenacted his merger with the gods. The farmers, by donating their labor to dig it, ritually participated in the cosmic order. The water that flowed out of it, through the irrigation canals into their fields, was holy water, blessed by the king's bath, capable of producing rice harvests that no ordinary water could match. This is the religious framework that makes the entire Khmer hydraulic system possible. Without it, the corvée labor collapses. With it, generations of farmers will donate their dry season labor to projects that will not be finished in their lifetimes. Jayavarman dies in 889. His son, Jayavarman I, takes the throne. Jayavarman is in his 30s or 40s at his coronation. He has been trained from childhood in Sanskrit, in Hindu ritual, in the long political philosophy of Devaraja kingship. His tutor, a famous Brahmin scholar named Vamasiva, is recorded in the inscriptions as the most accomplished Sanskritist of his generation. Jayavarman himself, by the testimony of the inscriptions he later commissions, is a poet of considerable skill. He inherits a wealthy, well-organized empire with one major weakness. The capital at Hariharalaya is located in a slightly inconvenient place. Hariharalaya sits south of the Candlelight Sap Lake, in the floodplain. Half the year, during the monsoon, the city is under several feet of water, not enough to destroy it, the buildings being raised on stone platforms, but enough to make ordinary life inconvenient. Streets become canals. Markets must be moved. Carts cannot be used. The other half of the year, the dry season, the city is high and dry, but the surrounding rice paddies are difficult to irrigate because the natural drainage of the landscape pulls water away from Hariharalaya rather than towards it. Jayavarman wants a better location. He surveys the surrounding countryside for several years, and he chooses, finally, a site 40 kilometers to the northwest, a flat plain at the northern end of the Candlelight Sap, where 4 small rivers converge at the foot of the Nam Kulin Plateau. This site has 3 significant advantages. First, it is higher than Hariharalaya. The annual monsoon floods do not reach it, even in the wettest years. The city Jayavarman builds there, well for the rest of its history, stand above the annual floods. Second, it has abundant fresh water. The 4 small rivers, the Siem Reap, the Roluos, the Stung Ki Krang, the Stung Kiwok, can all be diverted into canals. The Phnom Kulin Plateau, just to the north, is a natural watershed, the source of all the streams that feed the plain. Third, and most importantly, it has the Candlelight Sap, just to the south, the great natural fish reservoir that even today supplies most of the protein consumed in modern Cambodia. Jayavarman calls his new city Yasodarapura, the dwelling place of Jayavarman's glory. The name has not survived in modern usage. The name we use today is the one that became attached, gradually, over the next 1,000 years, to the cluster of temples at the city's center, Angkor, from the Khmer word Nokor, meaning simply the city, ultimately derived from the Sanskrit Nagara, in the symbolism of Khmer kingship. The new capital has to be more than a city. It has to be a model of the universe. So Jayavarman lays it out, deliberately, as a mandala, a sacred diagram of the Hindu cosmos. At its center, on a small natural hill called Phnom Bakeng, a sandstone outcrop rising about 60 meters above the surrounding plain, the only significant relief in the Angkor area, he builds his state temple. The temple is a stepped pyramid, 5 levels high, in red sandstone, surrounded by 68 small ancillary towers arranged in a precise geometric pattern. Each level of the pyramid is itself surrounded by 12 small towers, 12 representing the 12 months of the year, the 12 signs of the Hindu zodiac, the 12 avatars of Vishnu. The total number of towers on the temple is 108, a sacred number in Hindu cosmology, the number of beads on a Hindu prayer mala. Phnom Bakeng represents Mount Meru, the symbolic axis of the Hindu universe. From its summit, the king, who in death would merge with the god to whom the temple was dedicated, could survey his entire kingdom. On clear dry season days, you can see, from the top of Nam Baking, the misty silhouettes of the Phnom Kulen Plateau, 40 kilometers to the north, and the great water of the Tonle Sap 15 kilometers to the south. Around the temple, Yasovarman builds a perfect square of canals, 4 kilometers on each side. This represents, in the cosmological symbolism, the cosmic ocean that surrounds Mount Meru. The square is precisely aligned with the cardinal directions, its sides facing exactly north, south, east, and west. To the east of the city, Yasovarman digs the second of the great Khmer reservoirs, the East Barai, the Yasodhara Tataka. It is 6.5 kilometers long and 1.5 kilometers wide. It holds more than 50 million cubic meters of water, 5 times the volume of the Indra Tataka at Hariharalaya. It is, again, the single largest man-made structure anywhere in the world at the time of its construction. The work takes most of Yasovarman's reign. He dies, probably in the year 910, before the city is fully complete. His successors continue the project. Within 50 years, Yasodharapura, Angkor, is the most populous city in mainland Southeast Asia. Within 150 years, it will be the most populous city in the world. You are walking through Yasodharapura, somewhere around the year 950, just a generation after Yasovarman's death. You were a foreign visitor, perhaps a Chinese diplomat, perhaps an Indian Brahmin scholar, and you have arrived by canoe up the Tonle Sap. Then, through the network of canals that radiate northward from the Great Lake, you step out of the canoe onto a stone landing. The water of the canal is brown with monsoon silt. Small boats are tied up along the bank, flat-bottomed wooden boats, painted in faded red and blue, with small fishing nets piled in the bows. You can see immediately that this is a city built around water. Every street runs along a canal. Every house has a small dock at its back. The streets are paved in laterite blocks. The houses are raised on stone platforms with steep thatched roofs that overhang to keep off the monsoon rains. The walls are of woven bamboo and clay, freshly painted with white lime. You are taken to a guest house near the center of the city. The guest house is 2 stories high, built around a central courtyard. The lower floor is for animals. There are 2 oxen tied up in a stall, a small herd of pigs, half a dozen chickens. The upper floor is for guests. Your room is plain, a wooden floor, a thin cotton sleeping mat, a clay water jug. But it is clean. You bathe in the courtyard. You eat rice, fish and coconut milk, a stew of tropical vegetables, a small dish of fermented fish sauce, and a tropical fruit you do not recognize that your hosts tell you is called durian. Then, as the sun begins to set, you climb to the roof of the guest house. From this height, you can see the city laid out around you. To the south, the cluster of small wooden houses where the merchants and the artisans live, stretching for several kilometers along the canal network. To the east, the great East Baray gleaming under the sunset like a small inland sea. To the west, the 4-kilometer square of canals that defines the sacred precinct, with the red sandstone pyramid of Nam Bakeng rising at its center. To the north, the misty silhouette of the Phnom Kulen Plateau, where every drop of water that flows through this entire system originates. The smell of the city is layered. Beneath everything is the smell of mud and water, the brown smell of monsoon silt. Above that, the smell of cooking fires from 100,000 evening meals. Above that, the smell of jasmine from a temple courtyard somewhere nearby. Above that, the faint, sweet smell of frankincense, drifting on the breeze from the priest's quarter near Phnom Bakang. The sound of the city is also layered. Beneath everything, the constant slap of water against canal banks. Above that, the lowing of cattle, the cluck of chickens, the laughter of children playing in the canals. Above that, the steady drumbeat of bronze gongs marking the temple hours from each of the city's hundreds of small temple towers. Above that, the high call of evening prayer chants, Sanskrit syllables, drifting on the wind from a dozen different temples. You stand on the roof of your guest house for an hour, watching the city settle into evening. You realize slowly that you have arrived at one of the great cities of the world. The genius of the Khmer hydraulic system, you slowly understand over the days that follow, is not just the berets themselves. It is the way they integrate with the natural rhythm of the monsoon. During the rainy season, when water is abundant, the berets are not used. Excess monsoon water flows across the natural drainage of the landscape into the rice paddies, into the Tonle Sap, eventually back into the Mekong. The system is, during the wet season, simply ready and waiting. Then, as the monsoon withdraws in October, the great reservoirs fill to capacity. The intake gates are closed. The water is held. Through the long dry season, November, December, January, February, March, April, the water is released slowly through the network of canals. Rice can be planted twice more on the same fields in the dry months. The dry season harvests are what feed the city. But it is more than agriculture. The system has to be maintained constantly. The berets have to be dredged of silt. The Mekong Basin produces enormous sediment loads, and every monsoon deposits centimeters of mud on the bottom of every reservoir. The canals have to be unclogged of fallen vegetation. The dikes have to be patched after every monsoon. The intake gates have to be repaired. The dry season distributary network, the smallest canals, the ones that actually deliver water to individual rice paddies, has to be realigned every few years as the soil shifts. Every year, in the dry season, tens of thousands of laborers are sent out to maintain the system. This is the labor structure that makes the Khmer Empire possible. The Khmer kings do not need to buy slaves, or import foreign workers, or maintain a standing army of engineers. They have a religious system in which every farmer in every village owes, in theory, several weeks of corvée labor to the state each year. That labor, applied to the hydraulic system, is what keeps the city alive. When the labor system works, the city thrives. When the labor system breaks down, as it will, eventually, in the 14th and 15th centuries, the city dies. But that is a story for a later chapter. For now, in the late 9th and early 10th century, the system is working. The rice harvests are bountiful. The treasury is full. The population is growing. The Khmer Empire is on the verge of its golden age. In 2012, an Australian archaeologist named Damien Evans, working with a Cambodian team and a small helicopter borrowed from the French archaeological mission, mapped the entire Angkor region using a technology called LiDAR, light detection and ranging, a kind of laser radar that can see through forest canopy and reveal the contours of the ground beneath. The map he produced changed our understanding of the Khmer Empire. What Evans found beneath the canopy of the modern dipterocarp forest was a network of canals, dikes, roads, and small temple foundations that extended for several hundred square kilometers around the visible ruins of Angkor. The hydraulic system of the Khmer Empire was not just the two great berets and a few connecting canals. It was a vast geometric grid of irrigation infrastructure, stretching from Namol Kulen in the north to the Tonle Sap in the south, dividing the entire landscape into rice paddy units of remarkable regularity. The total area irrigated by the system, at its peak in the 12th and 13th centuries, was somewhere around 1,200 square kilometers, larger than the agricultural area of any other pre-industrial city in the world, comparable to the entire irrigated area of medieval Egypt during the same period. The labor required to build this system over the 4 centuries, from Jayavarman I to Jayavarman VII, was, by Evans's calculations, somewhere between 50 and 100 million person years. 50 to 100 million person years. That is the engineering effort that built the Khmer Empire. That is the price of a city of 1 million people in the middle of a dry forest. The capital of Angkor has risen. The empire is on the verge of its golden age. And now we follow a king who, more than any other, will turn that golden age into stone. His name is Jayavarman II, and he is going to build the largest religious monument ever made. His name is Jayavarman II. The name means Suryavarman, protected by the sun. The second Because the founding Chakravartin of the Khmer Empire 3 centuries earlier had also been a Suryavarman I in the early 11th century, who had unified the western provinces but is otherwise a minor figure in Khmer history. Our Suryavarman is the second to bear the name, and he is anything but minor. He takes the throne in the year 1113 of our era, after a brief but bloody succession struggle. The previous king, his great-uncle Dharanendravarman I, had been an old man, unmarried, with no clear heir. When Dharanendravarman died, Suryavarman, who at this point was probably in his late teens or early 20s, assembled a coalition of regional princes and rode his elephant into the royal palace at Angkor, killed his great-uncle's nominated successor on the spot, and took the throne. He is, by Khmer standards, young. By the standards of Khmer kingship, the act is brutal, but not unusual. 3 of the previous 5 kings had also taken the throne by force. What matters is what he does next. He inherits an empire at the peak of its prosperity. The hydraulic system that Indravarman and Yasovarman began 2 centuries earlier has been expanded by every king since. The 2 great berets, the East Beret, completed under Yasovarman, and the now completed West Beret, finished under Udayadityavarman II around the year 1060. Between them hold more water than any reservoir built anywhere in the world before the construction of the Aswan Dam in 1970. The rice harvests are bountiful. The treasury is full. The vassal kingdoms, in what is today Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, and southern Burma, pay tribute regularly. The population of the capital, Yasodarapura, is somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people. It is, at this moment, the largest city anywhere on earth. Suryavarman wants 2 things from this wealth. First, he wants conquest. He spends the first decade of his reign at the head of his armies. He invades west, into the Mon kingdoms of central Thailand. Lopburi falls in 1116. Haripunjaya soon after. He invades east, into the coastal kingdoms of central Vietnam. Champa, the Khmer's hereditary enemy, is invaded twice, in 1123 and again in 1123 and again in 1128. The Cham capital of Vijaya is sacked the second time, and a Khmer vassal king is installed. He invades south, into the small principalities of the Malay Peninsula, what is today southern Thailand and northern Malaysia. Then a maze of small Tamil-speaking trading kingdoms. He invades north, briefly, into what is today's southern Laos, securing the upper Mekong against the Dai kingdoms migrating southward from southern China. By the year 1130, the Khmer Empire under Suryavarman is the most powerful state in mainland Southeast Asia, by a margin that will not be matched until the rise of the modern Thai kingdoms 3 centuries later. The Chinese chronicles of the Song dynasty record, with their usual detached precision, that the king of Chenla, they still use the old name for Cambodia, possesses 200,000 war elephants, and his armies have conquered every kingdom from the sea to the great mountains. 200,000 war elephants is almost certainly an exaggeration. The real number was probably 2,000 or 3,000. But the perception, in the courts of China and India, is that Suryavarman is unstoppable. In 1145, in the last great campaign of his life, Suryavarman leads a second sack of the Cham capital at Vijaya. He carries off, according to the Chinese accounts, all the bronze of the Cham temples and all the gold of the Cham treasury. The loot is so vast that several thousand bullock carts are required to transport it back to Angkor. Cham bronze, melted down and recast, will be used in the final phases of construction at Angkor Wat. The wars are the means. The temple is the end. A Khmer king is, in his lifetime, the human face of his chosen god. Each king selects a god. Shiva, the destroyer, is the most common choice. Vishnu, the preserver, is the second most common. Rarely, in the case of Jayavarman VII 70 years later, a king chooses the Buddha, and builds his life around the worship of that god. He performs daily rituals at the god's altar. He commissions Brahmin scholars to compose Sanskrit hymns in the god's honor. He decorates his palace with images of the god. He travels with a portable shrine of the god on his royal elephant, and he builds during his lifetime a state temple. The state temple is many things at once. It is the god's earthly residence, a literal house with sanctuaries and side chapels and storage rooms for ritual implements. It is the king's tomb. It is the king's monument, the building his successors will use to remember him. It is, most importantly, the place where the king will, after his death, merge with his chosen god and become, in some sense, immortal. In the Khmer theological understanding, this merger is real. The king does not merely go to heaven or be remembered. His soul, after death, fuses with the soul of the god. The two become one. The state temple is the dwelling place of the merged god-king. Visitors to the temple, in the centuries after the king's death, are not visiting a tomb. They are visiting a still-living divine presence. Almost every Khmer king before Jayavarman had built a state temple dedicated to Shiva. Bakon at Hariharalaya, Vaminicus, the small palace temple at Yasodarapura, Prerup, the great brick pyramid of Jayavarman II, Bafuwan, the colossal but structurally unstable temple of Jayavarman II, which collapsed in stages over the centuries and is still being reconstructed by French archaeologists today. Jayavarman is different. He is a Vaishnavite, a worshipper of Vishnu, the preserver of cosmic order in Hindu theology, the protector of Dharma, the guardian of righteous kinship. Vishnu, in the symbolism of his worship, is the perfect god for an empire builder. He is associated with the chakra, the spinning discus, the wheel that in Vaishnavite cosmology represents the wheel-turning power of the universal monarch. He is associated with the Avatara, the divine descent. Vishnu takes 10 forms across the cosmic ages to restore order when it has been lost. He is associated in his 4th avatar with the boar Varaha, who lifts the earth out of the cosmic ocean. Jayavarman has spent the first decade of his reign at war, expanding his empire, restoring, in his court's interpretation, the proper order of the world. He believes, and his Brahmin scholars encourage him to believe, that his wars have served a cosmic purpose, that he has, like Vishnu in the great Hindu epics, become a wheel-turning monarch. His state temple, therefore, will be dedicated to Vishnu, and it will be the largest temple ever built. The construction of Angkor Wat begins around the year 1122, while Jayavarman is in his early 30s, and the Cham campaigns are still being planned. The site is chosen with care. Jayavarman picks a flat plain just to the south of the existing capital at Yasodarapura, where the soft alluvial soil can support enormous foundations. The site is, importantly, not inside the symbolic mandala square of canals that defines the religious center of Yasovarman's old city. It is just outside in what would become a new sacred precinct dedicated to Jayavarman alone. The temple will face west. This is a deliberate departure from Khmer tradition, in which state temples almost always face east toward the rising sun. The westward orientation has been the subject of intense scholarly debate for over a century. The most likely explanation today is that Vishnu is associated in Hindu cosmology with the western direction, the direction of the setting sun, the direction of the end of the day, the direction of the long final stage of cosmic time. A temple to Vishnu, dedicated to a king who will become a merged god-king after his death, should logically face west. A secondary interpretation is funerary. Angkor Wat was always partly intended as Jayavarman's tomb, and the westward orientation reflects that. The bas-relief program on the Western Gallery, which depicts Jayavarman alive on his throne, would in this reading be the eternal audience hall of the dead king. A third interpretation, supported by recent astronomical analysis, is that the temple is aligned with the spring equinox sunrise as seen from the western entrance, meaning that On the morning of the spring equinox, the sun rises behind the central tower as viewed from the main approach. This would be cosmologically powerful. Most likely, all three interpretations are partly true. The stone for Angkor Wat is quarried at Nam Kulen, the sandstone plateau 40 kilometers to the north, the same plateau where, 320 years earlier, Jayavarman II had performed the founding coronation ritual on the slope of Mahendra Parvata. The choice of Nam Kulen is no accident. It links Suryavarman's temple, cosmologically, to the founding moment of the Khmer Empire. Every block of sandstone in Angkor Wat is, in a sense, a fragment of the same sacred mountain on which the first Chakravartin was anointed. The technical challenge of moving sandstone 40 kilometers is enormous. The Khmer have no draft animals capable of dragging blocks of sandstone over that distance. Water buffalo are too slow. Elephants are too valuable for war. So Suryavarman's engineers build instead a 35-kilometer canal, straight and narrow, dug by tens of thousands of dry-season corvée laborers, connecting the Phnom Kulen quarries to the construction site at the future Angkor Wat. The blocks of sandstone, some of them weighing more than a ton, are roughed out at the quarry by stonemasons. Then they are loaded onto bamboo rafts at small docks built into the side of the plateau. The rafts float down the canal during the monsoon flood season, June to October, when the canal is fully fed by Phnom Kulen's spring runoff. At the construction site, cranes built of long timber A-frames lift the blocks onto wooden sledges, which are then rolled into position by teams of workers using log rollers. The bamboo raft canal is one of the great engineering achievements of medieval Asia. It is still partly visible today as a long, faint line of slightly darker rice paddies running north-south through the Cambodian landscape, marked on no road map, known to almost no tourists. Most people who visit Angkor Wat have no idea it exists. The labor force is, again, the Great Khmer Corvée system. Tens of thousands of farmers, every dry season, are sent to the construction site to dig foundations, move blocks, lift sledges, and carve stone. The work is donated. In the official theology of the kingdom, every farmer earns spiritual merit for his labor, and his village earns a partial credit against future tax demands. The construction proceeds in three main phases. The first phase, from about 1122 to 1135, builds the foundations and the outer enclosure. The moat is dug, 200 meters wide on each of the four sides, 1.5 kilometers on each side, a man-made rectangle of water so large that it is still, today, visible from low Earth orbit. The first stones of the outer Gopura, the western entrance pavilion, are laid. The cosmic ocean is, in symbolic terms, completed. The second phase, from 1135 to 1145, builds the inner enclosure and the cruciform terrace. The 800 meters of bas relief on the first gallery are roughed in by senior sculptors and finished by teams of apprentices. The two libraries, small temple buildings flanking the main causeway, are completed. The third phase, from 1145 to 1150, builds the three-level central temple. The 5 lotus bud towers rise, one block of sandstone at a time, in the slow, patient rhythm of medieval stone construction. It takes about 35 years from start to finish. The architects designed the temple as a series of concentric enclosures, each enclosure representing a layer of the Hindu cosmos. The outermost enclosure is the moat. It is the cosmic ocean, the great waters that, in Hindu cosmology, surround the central continent of the universe. To cross the moat, you walk along a long stone causeway, 200 meters long, lined on each side with stone balustrades carved in the form of long Naga serpents, the multi-headed cosmic snakes that, in Hindu mythology, support the earth. The causeway enters the second enclosure, a 4-sided stone wall with gates on each side. The main entrance gate on the western side is a long pavilion building with 3 towers and 4 sub-shrines. Above the central entrance, a Sanskrit inscription names the temple Bra Vishnulok, the sacred dwelling of Vishnu, and dedicates it, in elegant Sanskrit verse, to the king who is the wheel-turning monarch of all the worlds, the protector of the four corners, the human face of Vishnu on earth. Inside the second enclosure is the third, the cruciform terrace, paved in dark sandstone, surrounded by smaller library buildings. The third enclosure is where the priests and the senior dancers gather during ceremonies. There are, by the surviving inscriptions, 615 Apsara dancers permanently attached to Angkor Wat, organized into companies under senior dance masters. They perform daily, at dawn, at noon, at sunset, and at midnight, the elaborate sacred dances of the Khmer court tradition. And inside the third enclosure rises the temple itself. It is a stepped pyramid in 3 levels, each level a square gallery wrapping around the level above. The first level is enormous, 800 meters of total interior corridor, lined on the inside with the famous carved bas-reliefs. The second level is smaller, lined with carved apsaras, nearly 2,000 of them, no two alike. The largest single concentration of dancer imagery in any building anywhere in the world. The third level is the central sanctuary, accessible only by extraordinarily steep stone stairs, so steep in the original Khmer design that you climb them on hands and knees, in a deliberate gesture of cosmic humility. At the center of the third level rises the main tower, 65 meters tall, in the shape of an unfolding lotus bud. At each of its 4 corners rises a slightly smaller tower, in the same lotus shape. The 5 towers, viewed from the western causeway across the moat, form the famous silhouette that appears today on the flag of independent Cambodia, and on the cover of nearly every guidebook to mainland Southeast Asia. Each lotus tower originally contained a stone sanctuary, accessible only through narrow stone doorways. The central sanctuary, the highest, originally held a 4-armed gold statue of Vishnu, 6 meters tall, made from over 100 kilograms of gold, plated over a wooden frame. Vishnu, in the iconographic tradition of Khmer art, holds in his 4 hands the 4 symbols of his divine power: the chakra, the spinning discus in his upper right hand, the shankha, the conch shell, in his upper left, the gada, the mace, in his lower right, and the padma, the lotus flower, in his lower left. The statue was looted, probably during the sham raid of 1177, 22 years after the temple's completion, and never recovered. The empty stone chamber is still there today, climbed by tourists who do not always realize what they are climbing toward. The bas-reliefs of Angkor Wat are by themselves one of the great achievements of human art. They run for 800 meters around the first level gallery. They are about 2 meters high. They are carved into the sandstone in shallow relief, between 3 and 6 centimeters deep, originally painted in red and gold and blue, though the paint has long since faded to bare gray-pink stone. The reliefs are not random. They are organized. They tell, in deliberate sequence, the great stories of Hindu cosmology, reading clockwise from the southern gallery. The southern gallery is dedicated to the Battle of Kurukshetra, the climactic battle of the Mahabharata, the great Hindu epic in which the noble Pandava brothers fight their cousins, the Kauravas, for the throne of the kingdom of Kuru in northern India. The relief is enormous. It shows thousands of soldiers, hundreds of war chariots, dozens of named heroes from the epic. In the center, the god Krishna, an avatar of Vishnu, the same god to whom the temple is dedicated, drives the chariot of the warrior Arjuna into the heart of the battle. The Mahabharata is, theologically, the great epic of dharmic warfare. Its placement on the southern gallery of Angkor Wat is a deliberate parallel between the cosmic battles of the Hindu epics and the recent wars of conquest by Suryavarman. The western gallery is dedicated to Suryavarman himself. This is the only relief in Angkor Wat that depicts a living person, or at least a contemporary one. Suryavarman is shown sitting on a throne, larger than all the other figures, with his 19 ministers arrayed around him, each labeled by name in a Sanskrit inscription. Below him, the Khmer army marches off to war, infantry in lamellar armor, cavalry on small Cambodian horses, the famous Khmer elephant corps with each elephant ridden by a mahout and a warrior with a long lance. The march continues for nearly 100 meters of carved relief, eventually reaching its destination at the Cham capital of Vijaya, where the climactic battle scene shows the Khmer army storming the walls. Above Jayavarman, a small Sanskrit inscription identifies him as Param Avishnuloka, the one who has gone to the supreme realm of Vishnu. The inscription was carved after his death. It is the posthumous name given to the king once his merger with Vishnu was theologically confirmed by the priesthood. The northern gallery is dedicated to the battle of Devas and Asuras, the cosmic war between the gods and the demons, an ongoing struggle in the Hindu mythological imagination that periodically erupts into full-scale battle when the demons grow too strong. Vishnu, riding his vehicle, Garuda, the divine eagle, leads the gods into battle. The relief, in its theology, parallels Jayavarman's role as the human Vishnu, riding his royal elephant into battle against the Cham demons on the western gallery. And the eastern gallery is dedicated to the most famous of all the reliefs, the churning of the ocean of milk. The story comes from the Bhagavata Purana, a Sanskrit theological text composed somewhere in northern India around the 5th century of our era. The gods and the demons, for once cooperating, are stirring the cosmic ocean in order to extract the Amrita, the elixir of immortality. They are using the cosmic serpent Vasuki as a churning rope wrapped around the cosmic mountain Mandara, which sits on the back of the cosmic turtle Kurma, the second avatar of Vishnu, who has descended into turtle form to support the churning. Vishnu, in his more familiar four-armed form, stands at the center, balancing the entire arrangement with his four arms. The relief is 50 meters long. It contains hundreds of individual figures, 88 gods on one side, 92 demons on the other, all pulling rhythmically on the long body of the cosmic snake. Their faces are calm, intent, almost meditative. The act of churning the ocean is, in the spiritual interpretation of the story, a metaphor for the slow, patient work of attaining enlightenment. The universe must be churned in the same slow rhythm, generation after generation, in order for the elixir of immortality to eventually rise to the surface. The churning of the ocean of milk relief is, by many measures, the single greatest piece of stone sculpture in the history of mainland Southeast Asia. Indian Sanskritists who visit Angkor today, looking at the relief, frequently comment that they have never seen the story depicted so completely or so beautifully anywhere in India itself. Construction of Angkor Wat takes, in total, about 35 years. For most of that time, Jayavarman is at war. He returns from his campaigns once a year, at the start of the dry season, to inspect the construction. He brings tribute from his vassal kingdoms, gold from Champa, silver from the Mon kingdoms of Thailand, ivory from the Burmese highlands, perfumed sandalwood from the small Tamil principalities of the Malay Peninsula, to fund the temple's continuing work. In the year 1145, he leads his last great campaign, the second sack of Vijaya. He returns to Angkor with so much loot that the construction of his temple is accelerated by years. 5 years later, in the year 1150, Jayavarman dies. He is probably in his 50s. The exact circumstances are not recorded. Some inscriptions suggest he died of fever after returning from a third Cham campaign. Others suggest he died peacefully in his palace. The temple is not quite finished at his death. Some of the outer bas-reliefs are still being carved. The library buildings are still being completed. The third Cham campaign that may have killed him was, by the records, intended to be the final triumphal expedition before his death, the conquest that would secure the empire's eastern frontier in perpetuity. But the main structure, the 5 towers, the 800 meters of corridor, the moat, the causeway, the libraries, is essentially complete. Jayavarman is interred, according to royal tradition, in the central sanctuary of his temple. His body is placed in a hollow stone chamber beneath the floor of the highest tower, at the foot of the gold statue of Vishnu. The chamber is sealed with a single carved sandstone slab inscribed in Sanskrit with the king's posthumous name, Arhamavishnu Loka. He has become, in the theology of his court, one with Vishnu. His state temple, in the centuries that follow, will be referred to in surviving inscriptions only by that posthumous name. The name or Wat, meaning in modern Khmer simply the temple of the city, comes from a much later period, after the empire itself had been forgotten and the temple had become a regional Buddhist pilgrimage site. For 3 decades after Jayavarman's death, Angkor Wat is the religious center of the Khmer Empire. Brahmin priests perform daily rituals at the central altar. Apsara dancers perform in the courtyards. Tens of thousands of pilgrims visit each year from across the empire, walking the Western Causeway, crossing the cosmic ocean, entering the sacred precinct, climbing the steep stairs to the central tower, leaving offerings of incense and rice and small bronze figures at the foot of Vishnu's golden statue. Then, in 1177, comes the Cham raid that we will follow in the next chapter. Jayavarman's empire is sacked. The gold statue of Vishnu is looted. The wooden palaces of Yasodarapura are burned. The construction projects of his successors are abandoned. It will take a different king in a different generation to rebuild Angkor. And when he does, he will not be a worshipper of Vishnu. He will be a Buddhist. The towers of Angkor Wat will stand untouched, while the new king builds his own different vision of compassionate kingship just a few kilometers to the north. The 2 temples, the Hindu and the Buddhist, the old empire and the new, will sit beside each other for the next 250 years, the 2 greatest works of the Khmer imagination, until both are finally abandoned together in the long fall of the 15th century. But that is a story for the next chapter. Angkor Wat stands finished, its 5 lotus bud towers rising over the dry forest of Cambodia. Jayavarman is buried in its central sanctuary, become one with Vishnu, the preserver of the universe. And then, 25 years later, the unthinkable happens. The Khmer Empire is sacked, the capital is burned, the god-king of the world is forced to flee. And into that catastrophe walks an old prince in his 50s, who has spent decades in religious retreat, and who is about to rebuild the empire on a different theological foundation entirely. His name is Jayavarman VII. The Khmer royal court has known many Jayavarmans. The Chakravartin who founded the empire 3.5 centuries earlier on the slope of Mahendra Parvata was Jayavarman II. There have been 5 more Jayavarmans since, minor kings, sometimes overlapping in disputed successions, sometimes confused in the later genealogies by Brahmin scribes working centuries after the events. Our Jayavarman is the 7th and the last great one. He is born, probably, around the year 1125, early in the reign of Jayavarman II, the builder of Angkor Wat that we followed in the previous chapter. His father is a minor prince named Jayavarman II, a cousin of Jayavarman who briefly held the throne for a few years between Jayavarman's death and the rise of the next dominant king. His mother is named Jayarahudamani, a member of the senior royal household with strong claims to the throne in her own right through her grandmother. Jayavarman grows up in the inner court at Angkor, fluent in Sanskrit from childhood, trained in Hindu ritual by the senior Brahmin scholars of the kingdom, instructed in the philosophy of Devaraja kingship as it had been understood for 3 centuries. But at some point in his early adulthood, the sources are unclear about exactly when or why Jayavarman steps away from the court. He spends, by his own later accounts, decades in religious retreat. He may have been a forest monk in the highlands of central Cambodia, where the older Buddhist traditions had never entirely been displaced by the official Hindu cult of the court. He may have traveled abroad. There are hints in later inscriptions that he spent time in the Cham kingdom on the coast of Vietnam, perhaps as a hostage prince exchanged in one of the Khmer peace agreements, perhaps as a private student of Mahayana Buddhism, which had a stronger presence in the Cham coastal kingdoms than in inland Cambodia. He may have been a vassal lord in a distant province, governing on behalf of his royal cousins. The records do not say. What is certain is that during these decades of withdrawal, he becomes a Mahayana Buddhist. Mahayana Buddhism, the great vehicle tradition, is the form of Buddhism that, in this period, dominates East Asia. It is the Buddhism of China, of Korea, of Japan, of the rising kingdoms of inland Vietnam, and of certain forest monasteries in mainland Southeast Asia. It is dramatically different from the Theravada Buddhism that, 2 centuries later, would replace it in Cambodia. Mahayana teaches that the highest spiritual goal is not personal liberation, not just escaping the cycle of rebirth, as in earlier Buddhist traditions, but bodhicitta, the awakened mind of the bodhisattva. The bodhisattva is a being who has reached the threshold of full enlightenment, but who voluntarily delays his own final Buddhahood in order to remain in the world and help all suffering beings reach the same realization. The central figure of Mahayana devotion is Avalokitesvara, Lokshvara in Sanskrit, Guanyin in Chinese, Kannon in Japanese, the Bodhisattva of compassion. He is the one who hears the cries of the world. In the iconographic tradition, Avalokitesvara is depicted with many arms, sometimes 1,000, each holding a different implement for relieving a different kind of suffering: a medicine jar for the sick, a noose for those in danger, a jewel for the poor, a book for those in ignorance, a flower for those in despair. He is also frequently depicted with many faces, sometimes 11, sometimes 4, occasionally as many as 84, each gazing in a different direction so that no suffering being is overlooked. The faces are calm. They are smiling very slightly with closed eyes. They are not the faces of a judging deity. They are the faces of a being who has chosen, voluntarily and consciously, to remain present to suffering rather than escape into pure transcendence. This is the religion Jayavarman VII, in his middle age, has chosen. It is, for a Khmer prince of the 12th century, an unusual choice. The Hindu cult of Devaraja kingship is the official theology of the entire court. To embrace Mahayana Buddhism is to step outside that framework, to embrace the Bodhisattva of compassion as one's central deity. In a court that has worshipped Shiva and Vishnu as the cosmic patrons of warfare and conquest for 3 centuries, is, in a quiet way, revolutionary. And then, in the year 1177, his country is sacked. The Cham raid on Angkor is one of the most extraordinary military events in medieval Southeast Asian history. The Chams are not a great empire. They are a federation of small coastal kingdoms along the central coast of what is today Vietnam and Tripura in the north, Vijaya in the center, Panduranga in the south. Their capital, in the mid-12th century, is at Vijaya, near the modern Vietnamese city of Quy Nhon. Their navy consists of perhaps a few hundred war canoes, long, narrow, painted boats with high prows, manned by warriors with bronze spears and iron-tipped arrows. By every measure of medieval Southeast Asian warfare, the Chams should not be able to attack Angkor. Angkor is hundreds of kilometers inland, accessible only by water, up the Mekong from the South China Sea, across the great inland lake of the Tonle Sap, into the network of canals that surround the capital. It is, in theory, impregnable. The Khmer have spent 3 centuries building outposts at every navigable choke point on the Mekong, with garrisons of war elephants and trained infantry. But in 1177, a Cham king named Jayavarman IV assembles a war fleet of unprecedented size. He does not announce his intentions. He launches the fleet from the Cham capital, sails north along the coast of Vietnam, turns west around the Cape of Samao Mao, enters the Mekong Delta, and instead of stopping at the Khmer outposts as a delegation, he simply attacks them in passing with overwhelming numerical force. The Khmer outposts on the Mekong are caught completely by surprise. They have not been at war with the Chams for almost 30 years. They are undermanned, complacent, and outnumbered. The Cham fleet sails past them into the Tonle Sap and lands its army on the southern shore of the Great Lake, less than 30 kilometers from Angkor. The Khmer king at this moment is not Jayavarman VII. It is a minor king named Jayavarman, a usurper who had killed the previous king, Yasovarman II, in a palace coup 6 years earlier. He is unprepared. His army is undermanned, having been recently demobilized from a small campaign in the western Mon kingdoms. He marches out from Angkor with the Elephant Corps and the household cavalry to meet the Chams in the field at the edge of the Tonle Sap floodplain, and his army is destroyed in a single afternoon. The Chams enter Yasadarapura. They sack it. They burn the wooden palaces. They strip the temples of Angkor Wat and the surrounding monuments of their gold and bronze fittings. They carry away the Asura dancers. They carry away the elephants. They carry away the small bronze statues from every minor shrine. They carry away, most importantly, the four-armed gold statue of Vishnu from the central sanctuary of Angkor Wat, the statue that Jayavarman had commissioned 25 years earlier as the central object of his entire theological program. Tribhuvanada Jayavarman is killed in the fighting. His head, according to the later Khmer accounts, is carried back to Vijaya as a trophy. The capital is, for the first time in 3 centuries, in the hands of a foreign army. And then, from somewhere outside the empire, from his religious retreat, from his forest monastery, from wherever he has spent the previous 30 years, Jayavarman VII appears. He is in his 50s. He gathers a Khmer army from the loyal provinces that have not yet been overrun, primarily from the southern provinces along the Mekong, from the western Mon-influenced provinces, from the Khmer Cham border zone where local lords have personal grievances against the Cham raid. He marches on the Chams. The campaign takes 4 years. It is fought partly by land, partly by river, partly on the open water of the Tonle Sap itself. The decisive battle is fought on the lake. In 1181, the war fleets of the 2 kingdoms meeting in the middle of the Great Inland Sea, in a naval engagement that the later Khmer bas-reliefs at the Bayon will depict in extraordinary detail. The Cham fleet, the bas-reliefs show, is destroyed by burning ships sent by the Khmer downwind. The Cham army on the southern shore of the lake is cut off and surrounded. Jayavarman IV is killed in the fighting. The Cham capital of Vijaya falls to Khmer counter-invasion. Later the same year, Jayavarman is crowned at Angkor. In the same year, he is 56 years old. By the standards of his era, he is already in late middle age. He should be, by all reasonable expectations, an interim king, a placeholder until a younger member of the royal family can take the throne. But Jayavarman VII has other plans. In the next 37 years, between the year 1181 and his death around the year 1218, he will completely rebuild the Khmer Empire. He will rebuild it on a different plan, in a different style, for a different god. He will turn it, in a single generation, into the most extensive Buddhist polity that mainland Southeast Asia has ever produced. He does this through 3 great projects. The first project is the rebuilding of Angkor itself. Jayavarman's Angkor Wat is left untouched. It is too sacred even to a Buddhist king to be dismantled. The 5 lotus bud towers continue to rise, exactly as they had risen for the previous quarter century, on the same sandstone platform south of the old capital. Brahmin priests continue, in slightly reduced numbers, to perform the daily rituals at the temple's altar. The Apsara dancers, the surviving members of the company that had not been carried off by the Chams, return to their daily performances. But Jayavarman does not move his court into Angkor Wat. He builds instead a new city, just to the north of Angkor Wat. He calls it Angkor Thom, Great Angkor. It is enclosed by a square wall, 12 kilometers long in total perimeter, 8 meters high, made of laterite faced with sandstone. The wall is surrounded, in the Khmer fashion, by a moat 100 meters wide. The moat is filled with water from the East Berai, channeled through a system of underground stone conduits, a major hydraulic engineering project in its own right, requiring the construction of stone-faced tunnels under the existing canal network. The wall has 5 gates, one on each of the 4 cardinal directions, plus one on the eastern side, aligned specifically with the entrance to the royal palace. Each gate is a stone tower, 23 meters high, supporting on its summit a single colossal stone tower. And each gate at its summit is crowned with 4 faces, 4 enormous stone faces, each carved from the king's own features, but representing the calm compassion of Avalokiteshvara. They look outward north and south and east and west, smiling faintly. They are the first thing a visitor sees on approaching Angkor Wat from any direction. Avalokiteshvara, in the form of Jayavarman, watching every traveler from a great height with the gentle expression of a bodhisattva who has already promised to relieve their suffering. The faces are everywhere inside Angkor Wat as well. The royal palace, at the center of the city, is fronted by the Bayan Jayavarman's state temple. The Bayan is, architecturally, one of the strangest buildings in the world. It is a 3-level stone temple with no clean lines, no symmetric exterior, no obvious organizing principle. It rises from a maze of small chapels and connecting corridors into what scholars have called a forest of stone towers. There are 54 of these towers, each between 20 and 30 meters tall. Every tower, on each of its 4 sides, is carved with a face. That is 216 faces in total, all identical, all smiling, all looking in different directions. When you walk through the Bayan at noon, with the sun directly overhead, the faces seem to be watching you from every angle at once. There is no direction you can turn that is not under their gaze. The effect is meant to be reassuring. It represents Avalokiteshvara's universal compassion. The fact that no suffering being in any direction is overlooked. To modern visitors, particularly those visiting alone at dusk, it can also be unsettling. The bas-reliefs around the lower levels of the Bayan are different from those of Angkor Wat in a crucial way. They do not depict Hindu mythology. They depict instead scenes from ordinary Khmer life. Markets, fishing, cockfighting, childbirth, the crossing of the Tamli Sap on a flat-bottomed boat, the grilling of fish on bamboo skewers over open coals, women carrying water jugs on their heads, children playing knucklebones in the dust of a courtyard, a wrestling match between 2 men in the central square of a provincial town, a doctor examining the swollen leg of an elderly farmer, and in the most famous section, the naval battle of the Tamli Sap, the Khmer fleet of long, thin canoes engaging the Cham fleet in 1181, with the king's own elephant visible on a barge in the rear, supervising the battle. The faces of common people, peasants, merchants, soldiers, women carrying water jugs, are carved into the stone with the same care, the same individuated attention as the faces of gods at Angkor Wat. It is, in its quiet way, the most democratic art ever produced by an Asian medieval monarchy. The second project is the building of the hospitals. Jayavarman, in inscriptions he himself commissioned, claims to have built 102 hospitals across his empire. He calls them Arogyashalas, houses of healing, and he describes them, in considerable detail, on a series of stone stelae erected at the entrance to each one. Modern archaeology has found the foundations of 17 of these hospitals, scattered across the Khmer-speaking world, from what is today eastern Thailand to central Cambodia to southern Laos. Each one has a stone outer wall. Each one has a central chapel for ritual healing, dedicated to Baisajaguru, the Buddha of medicine. Each one has a residential building for the staff and the patients. Each hospital, according to the inscriptions, employs 104 people: physicians, nurses, pharmacists, cooks, gardeners, and ritual specialists. Each one keeps a stock of 248 different medicinal compounds, mostly herbal, some mineral, listed in detail on the inscriptions. The most common are familiar to modern Cambodian traditional medicine: turmeric for inflammation, ginger for fever, areca nut for parasites, neem leaf for skin disease. The hospitals are free. They are open to anyone, Khmer or foreign, peasant or noble, Hindu or Buddhist, who requires care. The inscriptions explain Jayavarman's motivation in terms that are surprisingly direct. Even today, he suffered from the suffering of his subjects more than from his own. The pain of his people was the pain of the king. The cure of their pain was, before his own, his duty. It is one of the most striking statements of compassionate kingship in all of Asian political philosophy, and it was put into practice, in stone, in more than 100 locations across an empire of 10 million people. A modern epidemiologist looking at the geography of the 17 surviving hospital sites would note something striking. They are distributed along the major roads, almost exactly one hospital every 50 kilometers on the main north-south and east-west routes. This is the spacing required to ensure that no part of the empire is more than a single day's travel from medical care. It is, in other words, a deliberately engineered universal healthcare system, the closest historical parallel. For a public health system that was free, universally accessible, and built around a network of regional clinics, is probably the Roman public health system of the early empire under Augustus and his immediate successors. After Jayavarman, no comparable system would exist in Asia until the 20th century. Jayavarman builds, across his 37-year reign, a network of stone-paved highways connecting Angkor to the major provincial cities. 5 main roads radiate out from the capital: north toward what is today southern Laos, west toward central Thailand, east toward central Vietnam, southwest toward the Gulf of Thailand, and south toward the Mekong Delta and what is today southern Vietnam. Each road is 6 to 8 meters wide. Each is paved with laterite blocks, set in a deep gravel bed for drainage. Each crosses rivers on stone bridges, and a number of these bridges are still standing today, 800 years later, still carrying motor traffic in rural Cambodia. The Span Proctos Bridge, on the road from Angkor to the eastern provinces, is the largest pre-modern bridge still in use anywhere in mainland Southeast Asia. Each road is marked, every 12 to 15 kilometers, by a rest house, a covered stone pavilion where travelers can sleep, change horses, and obtain food. Jayavarman claims in inscriptions to have built 121 of these rest houses. Modern archaeology has identified the foundations of 57 of them. The road system is, by the standards of any medieval empire, extraordinary. The total length of paved Khmer roads at the peak of Jayavarman's reign was somewhere around 2,000 kilometers, comparable to the entire road system of the Roman Empire at the time of Augustus, and built in a single generation rather than in the 400 years of Roman road construction. The road system would not be matched in scale by any later Southeast Asian polity until the 19th century, when the French colonial administration began the slow project of rebuilding Cambodia's transportation infrastructure. Jayavarman VII dies, probably, around the year 1218. He is in his early 90s. By the standards of his time, his reign has been astonishingly long. 37 years on the throne after a coronation that came when he was already 56. He has rebuilt his capital. He has built more than 100 hospitals. He has paved a national road network. He has driven out the Chams and conquered them in return. He has expanded the empire to its greatest extent, and he has done all of this in the name of compassion, of Avalokiteshvara, of the Bodhisattva who hears the cries of the world. The empire he leaves behind is the largest, the wealthiest, and the most centrally organized polity in mainland Southeast Asian history. The population, at the moment of his death, is somewhere around 10 million people, slightly larger than the contemporary population of England, 3 times the population of Italy at the same period, comparable to the population of Tang China at its peak 5 centuries earlier. It will not last. After Jayavarman's death, his immediate successors, his son Indravarman II, then his grandson Jayavarman VIII, will quietly revert to Hinduism. The Bayan will be rededicated to Shiva. The faces of Avalokiteshvara will, in some places, be deliberately defaced. The smiling stone features chiseled out and replaced with Shiva Lingam altars. The hospital network will be allowed to deteriorate. The roads will fall into disrepair. Why? The most likely explanation is sociological. Jayavarman's Buddhism was, in the end, a personal project. It was the religion of one extraordinary king, supported by a small inner court of converts and a network of Mahayana monks imported from the Cham coastal kingdoms. The vast majority of the Khmer aristocracy, the regional lords, the senior priests, the military commanders, had remained Hindu throughout Jayavarman's reign. They had cooperated with his program because he was a successful king and because the campaigns against the Chams were necessary. They had not, in their hearts, become Buddhists. When Jayavarman died, the Hindu aristocracy reasserted its theological dominance. The Buddhist program of compassionate kingship, the hospitals, the rest houses, the road network, the bas-reliefs of common people, was allowed, gradually, to be forgotten. But it is not entirely forgotten today. The Bayan, with its 216 smiling stone faces, is still standing. The 17 surviving hospitals are still excavated. The Spayan Proptos Bridge is still in use, and modern Cambodian Buddhism, Theravada now, not Mahayana, still venerates Jayavarman VII as something close to a saint. His face, carved into the stone of the Bayan 800 years ago, still smiles outward in 4 directions. But what comes after Jayavarman? The slow centuries of decline, the failure of the hydraulic system, the rise of the Thai kingdoms, the final sack of Angkor in 1431. That is a story for the next chapter. Jayavarman VII is gone. The hospitals are still running. The roads are still paved. The 216 smiling faces of the Bayan still look outward in 4 directions. But something has gone out of the empire that will not come back. What follows is one of the strangest collapses in human history. Not a defeat in a single battle. Not a conquest by a single enemy. A slow 2-century unwinding as a religion changes, a climate shifts, and a labor system that had worked for 500 years quietly stops working. Jayavarman VII dies around the year 1218. In his early 90s, he leaves behind the largest, wealthiest, and most centrally organized polity in the history of mainland Southeast Asia. His hospitals are running. His roads are paved. His capital, Angkor Wat, is the largest city in the world by population. The hydraulic system is at peak capacity. The vassal kingdoms, Cham, Mon, Thai, all pay tribute. The population of the empire is somewhere between 9 and 10 million people. By every measure available to a medieval observer, the Khmer Empire is at its peak, and then it is over. Within a single generation of Jayavarman's death, the great construction projects stop. His son Jayavarman II takes the throne in 1218 and rules for 25 years, but he commissions almost no major buildings, a few temple repairs, a single small Mahayana shrine, the completion of a few unfinished hospitals from his father's program. His grandson Jayavarman VIII, who takes the throne in 1243 and rules for 52 years, the longest reign of any Khmer king, actively reverses his grandfather's Buddhist program. Under Jayavarman VIII, the Bayan is rededicated to Shiva. The central tower of the temple, which had originally held a colossal seated Buddha statue, is opened. The Buddha statue is removed, broken into pieces, and thrown into a deep well shaft below the temple floor. A new Shiva Lingam altar is installed. The same fate befalls the central altars of dozens of other Mahayana temples across the empire. In some places, the smiling stone faces of Avalokiteshvara on the temple walls are deliberately defaced, the carved features chiseled out with iron hammers. This is not, on its face, a collapse. Empires routinely change state religion. The successors are still recognized as Devarajas. The court rituals are still performed, just in the Hindu mode rather than the Buddhist. The bas-reliefs of Angkor Wat are still maintained. The Apsara dancers still perform. but something has gone out of the empire that will not come back. The 37-year burst of construction under Jayavarman VII had been, in many ways, the empire's last great act of self-belief. After him, the kings build smaller temples, refurbish existing ones, donate inscriptions and statues to local shrines. They do not build cities. They do not move rivers. They do not, in the inscriptions they leave behind, articulate a vision of what the empire is for. The empire is now, very gradually, on autopilot. In the year 1296, a Chinese diplomat named Zhou Daguan arrives at Angkor. Zhou is a junior official in the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol Chinese Empire founded by Kublai Khan's grandsons. He is part of a diplomatic mission sent by the Yuan Emperor Temur Khan, Kublai's grandson, to gather information about the southern kingdoms of mainland Southeast Asia. The Yuan are not yet planning to invade Cambodia, but they want to know what they would be invading if they did. Zhou is, by the standards of Mongol-era Chinese officialdom, well-trained. He speaks Mandarin and the southern Chinese coastal dialects. He has some basic Khmer, picked up from Khmer merchants in Gwangju before his departure. He keeps detailed notes in a small bound book of mulberry bark paper in the careful classical Chinese of the late Song Yuan transition. He spends a full year at Angkor, from the autumn of 1296 to the autumn of 1297, observing court ritual, market customs, religious practice, and daily life. When he returns to China, he writes a book. The book is called Zhenla Fengtuchi, The Customs of Cambodia. It is, by an enormous margin, the single most detailed surviving description of the Khmer Empire from any contemporary observer, native or foreign. Zhou's Angkor is still a great city. He describes a population of hundreds of thousands of households, which, at the standard medieval Asian household estimate of 5 to 6 people, would put the city at somewhere between 500,000 and 1,000,000 people. He describes the elaborate court ceremonies, the king on his elephant, the white parasols, the gold-tipped lances of the bodyguard, the saffron-robed Buddhist monks, Theravada by now, not Mahayana, processing through the central markets. He describes the daily morning audience in the royal palace, with the king sitting on a small platform of carved sandalwood and the regional governors prostrating themselves in long rows. He describes the religious landscape in which Hinduism, the older Mahayana Buddhism of Jayavarman VII, and the newly arriving Theravada Buddhism all coexist somewhat uneasily. He notes that the Theravada monks are gaining ground, particularly among the rural population. He notes that the Hindu Brahmins of the royal court treat the Theravada monks with polite distance, neither welcoming nor suppressing them. But Zhou also notices something the Khmer themselves seem not to have noticed. He notices that the great berets are no longer fully maintained. He notes, in a passage that medieval historians would rediscover only in the 20th century, that the western Berai is silting in. He notes that the irrigation canals nearest the city are clogged with vegetation. He notes that the rice harvests, while still adequate, are not what older Khmer informants remember from their grandparents' time. He does not understand what he is seeing. He has no way to know that the most important institutional commitment of the Khmer Empire, the institution that had, for 500 years, kept the hydraulic system running, is quietly being abandoned. The Khmer hydraulic system was a marvel. It was also a marvel of constant maintenance. The berets had to be dredged every several years. The canals had to be unclogged of fallen vegetation. The dikes had to be patched after every monsoon. The intake gates had to be repaired. The dry season distributary network, the smallest canals, the ones that actually delivered water to individual rice paddies, had to be realigned every few years as the soil shifted. All of this maintenance work was done by labor, specifically by corvée labor, the unpaid work that, in theory, every Khmer farmer owed to the state every year. Several weeks a year, In the dry season, every village across the empire sent its young men to whichever public works project the local royal official assigned them. This is the institution that breaks down in the 13th and 14th centuries. The reason it breaks down is, in part, religious. Theravada Buddhism, the simpler, more austere form of Buddhism that has been spreading northward through the Mon kingdoms from Sri Lanka, does not require god-kings. Theravada teaches that the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, who lived in northern India around 500 BCE, was not a god. He was a man, a particularly gifted man, with a particularly deep understanding of the human condition, but a man. He achieved enlightenment through his own sustained meditation. He taught that anyone, in principle, could achieve the same enlightenment through the same sustained meditation. He did not require worship. He did not require temples. He did not require the elaborate ritual apparatus of a court religion. This is a tremendously empowering theology. The farmer no longer needs the king. The farmer no longer needs the temple. The farmer no longer needs the elaborate apparatus of Devaraja kingship to find his own enlightenment. He needs only a quiet hour every day, a place to sit, the example of the senior monk, and the patience to attend to his own breath. By the early 14th century, Theravada Buddhism has swept the Khmer lowlands. The old temples are slowly converted into Theravada monasteries, or simply abandoned. The dancers are no longer fed at state expense. The Brahmin priests are no longer paid by the royal treasury. The corvée labor, once so reliable, is harder and harder to call up. The royal officials who go out to the villages in the dry season to summon the corvée labor are increasingly met with polite refusals. I cannot come this year, Lord. I am studying with the monk. I cannot come this year, Lord. My wife is sick, and I must care for her. I cannot come this year, Lord. The harvest was poor, and I must plant again. The officials do not have the political authority of their 12th century predecessors. They no longer believe themselves in the cosmic urgency of the corvée system. They accept the refusals. They report back to Angkor that fewer laborers are coming. The work that the corvée laborers used to do, the dredging of barrays, the unclogging of canals, the patching of dikes, does not, in any single year, fail catastrophically. It just gets postponed, then postponed again, then forgotten. By the time anyone notices, the system has begun to fail. And meanwhile, in the highlands of mainland Southeast Asia, the climate is beginning to change. In 1999, a team of scientists from the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory in New York published the results of a decade-long study of tree ring records from the highlands of mainland Southeast Asia. They had been collecting cores from ancient cypress trees, Phocienia hutchinsii, a tree species that can live for over 1,000 years, in protected forests on the borders of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Some of the cores were from trees more than 1,500 years old. The tree ring data showed, with unprecedented clarity, the rainfall history of mainland Southeast Asia going back to the year 900 of our era. What the data showed was startling. Between the years 1340 and 1430, exactly the period in which the Khmer Empire enters its final decline, mainland Southeast Asia experiences two of the most severe megadroughts of the past 1,000 years. The first lasts nearly 2 decades, from approximately 1345 to 1365. During this period, the monsoon weakens dramatically. The annual rainfall in central Cambodia drops by an estimated 30 to 40%. The rivers shrink. The Tonle Sap Lake fails to reverse direction in some years, meaning the entire fishery of central Cambodia, the protein source that fed the population, collapses for those years. The rice harvests, even with the surviving hydraulic system, fail. The second drought begins around 1390. It is shorter, only about 15 years, but it is more violent. It is punctuated by sudden, catastrophic floods, as the monsoon, when it does return, returns in compressed bursts. The pattern is the worst possible combination for a hydraulic system designed for a regular monsoon. The barrays are emptied by drought, then suddenly overwhelmed by flood. The dikes burst. The canals are choked with debris that the under-maintained system cannot clear. The Khmer hydraulic system, even at full corvée maintenance, would have struggled to absorb this kind of climate shock. With the labor pool collapsing as the population converts to Theravada Buddhism, the system has no chance. The berets silt up. The canals fill with vegetation. The rice paddies, no longer reliably watered, produce one harvest a year instead of 3. Famines become more frequent. The population begins to drift away from Angkor, south, toward the smaller cities along the Mekong, where the lower elevation rice fields are still watered by the Mekong floods. By the year 1400, the population of Angkor has fallen, by some estimates, by more than half. By 1420, it has fallen by 3/4. The city is still there, still beautiful, still ringed by its great moats. But it is, demographically, a shell. And meanwhile, in the western marches of the empire, a new power is rising. The Thai peoples, speaking a language family unrelated to the Austroasiatic languages of the Khmer, descendants of the Dai-Kadai-speaking populations of southern China, have been migrating southward through what is today southern China and northern Burma for several centuries. By the early 13th century, they have established small kingdoms in the central highlands of what is today Thailand. By the late 13th century, those kingdoms have coalesced into 2 larger polities, Sukhothai in the north and Ayutthaya in the south. Both kingdoms are organized. Both are hungry. Both have absorbed Theravada Buddhism from the Mon kingdoms, which means they have access to the same farmer-level religious tradition, that is, simultaneously, undermining the Khmer corvée system. They are, in effect, riding the same wave that is destroying their enemy. And both Thai kingdoms have absorbed something else, a new generation of weapons that has been spreading southward from China since the early 14th century. The first, firearms. Small handheld bronze tubes, fired by a slow-burning match, capable of throwing a lead ball through plate armor at 30 paces. The Chinese had invented gunpowder weapons centuries earlier, but the small portable hand cannon, the prototype of all later firearms, was developed in southern China in the late 13th century and spread rapidly through the trade networks of mainland Southeast Asia. The early firearms are unreliable, slow to reload, and dangerous to their users. The misfire rate, in good conditions, is somewhere around 1 shot in 20. But they have one decisive advantage. They require almost no training. A traditional Khmer archer required years of training to be effective. He had to learn to handle a long composite bow, to draw it correctly, to aim under field conditions with adjusted elevation, to maintain his equipment, to coordinate with his unit. The training was so elaborate that the Khmer Archer Corps was effectively a hereditary caste. Sons of archers became archers, and outsiders could not enter the corps. A peasant levy with a hand cannon required, by contrast, about 3 hours of practice to be operationally useful. Light the match. Point the tube at the enemy. Pull the trigger. Reload as best you can. Do not, under any circumstances, fire while standing in deep grass. This shifts the military balance. The Khmer army, traditionally based on elephants, archers, and elite cavalry, suddenly faces opponents who can field tens of thousands of farmer soldiers with effective weapons. The Khmer king cannot match this scale, especially as his own corvée system fails and his own population shrinks. In the year 1431, the date is approximate, the medieval chronicles disagree by a year or 2. The Thai king of Ayutthaya, Boromaracha II, marches on Angkor. His army is large, well-supplied, and equipped with the new firearms. The Thai chronicles claim he commanded 100,000 men. The modern estimates are more like 30,000. Either way, it is far larger than anything the Khmer can field. He arrives at the gates of Angkor Thom in the dry season. The siege is not long. The Khmer city, weakened by decades of drought and depopulation, cannot hold out against a well-organized attacker with gunpowder weapons. Boromaracha takes the city. He sacks it. He carries off the royal regalia, the golden crowns, the ceremonial swords, the white parasols of state, the lacquered conch shells used in the coronation rituals. He carries off the temple dancers, the apsaras, the inheritors of the dance traditions depicted on the walls of the Bayon, the last surviving members of the company that had been performing at Angkor for 6 centuries. He carries off the bronze statues of the Buddha. He carries off the elephants of the household guard. And this time, unlike the Cham raid of 254 years earlier, the Khmer do not rebuild. The court moves south, down the Mekong, to a smaller, more easily defended city called Phnom Penh, at the junction of the Tonle Sap River and the Mekong proper. The court rituals continue at a much smaller scale. The kings still call themselves Devarajas. The Brahmin priests still perform the old Sanskrit ceremonies, though now mostly from memory, as the actual texts have been progressively lost. But Angkor itself is abandoned. The temples are not destroyed. They are simply left, and the jungle, which had always been patient, begins slowly to walk back in. The Theravada Buddhist monks who remain in the region continue to visit Angkor Wat, which is, by 1500, an active Theravada Buddhist pilgrimage site. The 5 lotus bud towers of Suryavarman's original Hindu temple are reinterpreted as the 5 Buddhas of the Mahayana cosmology, even though the actual monastic population is now Theravada. The bas-reliefs of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are reinterpreted as scenes from previous lives of the Buddha. The faces of Avalokiteshvara on the Bayon are reinterpreted as the faces of the Buddha himself in his moment of supreme compassion. Cambodian kings, ruling now from Phnom Penh and later from Luvik and Udong, make occasional offerings at Angkor. A few foreign visitors pass through. A Chinese merchant named Chen Bicheng, writing in the late 1500s, leaves a brief description that compares Angkor Wat to a city of the gods, larger than any in China, with 5 sacred mountains at its center, surrounded by an ocean of stone. A Portuguese Capuchin friar named Antonio de Madalena visits in the 1580s and writes that the city was of such extraordinary construction that it is not possible to describe it with a pen, particularly since it is like no other building in the world. A Spanish official named Diogo do Couto, in the early 1600s, compares Angkor to the buildings of Rome. But these reports do not reach the European reading public. They are filed in colonial archives in Lisbon and Madrid and forgotten there for 2.5 centuries. For most of the world, Angkor, and the empire that built it, is simply lost. But not all the way lost. The next chapter is about how the lost was found again. In the year 1431, the Thai king of Ayutthaya sacks Angkor. The court flees south. The temples are left. For 400 years, the world forgets the Khmer Empire ever existed. And then, on a quiet afternoon in January of 1860, a young French naturalist named Henri Mouhot walks out of the jungle, and he sees the moat of Angkor Wat. To understand what happened to Angkor between 1431 and 1860, you have to understand that it was never completely abandoned. The Thai sack of 1431 did not destroy the temples. The Thai army carried off the regalia, the dancers, the statues, the elephants, but they did not in any sense demolish the city. The stone monuments, Angkor Wat, the Bayon, the great gates of Angkor Thom, the dozens of smaller temples scattered across the 4-kilometer square sacred precinct were left exactly as they were. The Thai king of Ayutthaya was, after all, a Buddhist. He had no theological interest in destroying Buddhist or Hindu monuments. He took the gold, he left the stone. And after the Thai army withdrew, the Khmer kings, now based in Phnom Penh, several hundred kilometers south, continued to regard Angkor as a sacred site. They visited it occasionally on royal pilgrimages. They made offerings at the main altar of Angkor Wat. They commissioned, periodically, the partial repair of certain temples, especially Angkor Wat itself. Angkor Wat, by the year 1500, has become an active Theravada Buddhist monastery. This is one of the most remarkable theological reinterpretations in the history of Asian religion. The temple was built as a Hindu monument dedicated to Vishnu by a king who saw himself as the human face of Vishnu on earth. By 1500, the temple has been reinterpreted by the local Theravada Buddhist community as a Buddhist site. The 5 lotus bud towers of Jayavarman's original temple are reinterpreted as the 5 Buddhas of the Mahayana cosmology. Vairocana at the center, with the 4 other Buddhas of the cardinal directions at the corners. The bas-reliefs of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, those great Hindu epics, are reinterpreted as the Jataka tales, the stories of previous lives of the historical Buddha. The 4-armed Vishnu in the central sanctuary is reinterpreted as a 4-armed manifestation of the Bodhisattva of compassion. A community of Theravada Buddhist monks lives in the outer courtyards. Their saffron robes, the same color as the morning sun on the moat at dawn, become, over the centuries, the dominant human presence in a temple originally built for entirely different gods. They sleep in small wooden cells built against the outer walls. They eat 1 meal a day, gathered before noon according to monastic discipline. They tend to the temple's gardens. They receive pilgrims from across Cambodia who come to make merit offerings at the central altar. The pilgrims do not know, and do not need to know, what the temple was originally built for. To them, Angkor Wat is simply that, the temple, the holiest single site in the Cambodian Buddhist landscape, the place where the prayers of common people are most powerfully heard by the cosmic Dharma. In the year 1632, a Japanese pilgrim named Kenryo Shimano arrives at Angkor Wat. Kenryo had been told by Theravada monks in Burma that the temple was the Jetavana Vihara, the grove in northern India where the historical Buddha Siddhartha Gautama had spent 20 rainy seasons of his teaching life. The Jetavana was, in the Buddhist sacred geography, one of the 4 most important pilgrimage sites in the world. Kenryo did not, of course, fact-check this claim. Communications between Asian Buddhist communities in the early 17th century were not what they had been in the days of the great Trans-Asian Buddhist diaspora. Kenryo took the Burmese monks at their word. He traveled 6 months overland from Burma to reach Angkor. When he arrived, he was so moved by the size and beauty of the temple that he carved an inscription in Sanskrit and Japanese on the wall of the inner gallery. The inscription is still there today. It is the oldest surviving piece of post-Empire graffiti at Angkor Wat. It reads, in Kenryo's careful Sanskrit, "In the year of the boar, in the reign of the Emperor Go-Mizunoo, the Japanese pilgrim Kenryo of Sakai, having traveled long, arrived at the Jetavana and was filled with joy beyond measure to find the holy site so beautifully preserved." He was wrong about which site he was at, of course. The Jetavana is in northern India, near the modern Indian town of Shravasti, 1,400 kilometers away from Angkor. But he was right that what he had found was holy. He stayed for nearly a year. He copied bas-relief scenes onto rolls of mulberry bark paper, which he carried back with him to Japan. The rolls survive today in a small Buddhist temple in Sakai, his hometown. They are, by some measures, the first European-style accurate visual records of Angkor, even though they were made by a Japanese pilgrim 2 centuries before the first European visitor. Spanish and the Portuguese came next. In the late 16th century, a series of Spanish and Portuguese missionaries, based in the Spanish-controlled Philippines and in the Portuguese trading posts along the South China Sea coast, made overland journeys into the Cambodian interior. They were looking, in part, for converts. They were looking, in part, for trade. They were also looking with the unself-conscious curiosity of their era for wonders to write home about. In 1585, a Portuguese Capuchin friar named Antonio de Madalena visited Angkor. He left a brief written description, dictated to a fellow friar after his return, that compares the temple to the buildings of ancient Rome. His report was sent to the Portuguese Royal Archives in Lisbon and was never published. It was rediscovered in the 1920s by a Portuguese historian working on early colonial-era documents. In 1603, a Spanish official named Diogo do Couto wrote a longer report. Diogo do Couto had been the official chronicler of Portuguese India, based in Goa, and he had access to Portuguese trade reports from across the Indian Ocean. His description of Angkor, partly based on Domitalina's account, partly based on independent Portuguese travelers who had visited the site, describes the moats, the towers, the bas-reliefs, the apsaras. He compares the temple to the buildings of Rome and to the great pyramids of Egypt. He notes the four-faced gates of Angkor Wat with particular fascination. His report was sent to Madrid, filed away in the Spanish colonial archives, and not rediscovered until the 19th century. None of these descriptions reached the European reading public. Angkor was, in the European imagination, simply a rumor. Travelers' tales, the kind of thing missionaries might write home about, that no one in Lisbon or Madrid quite believed. And then, for 2 centuries, even the missionaries stopped coming. The 17th and 18th centuries were not kind to mainland Southeast Asia. The Cambodian kingdom, increasingly squeezed between Thai pressure from the west and Vietnamese pressure from the east, became a minor vassal of both larger powers. Civil war was frequent. Roads were unsafe. Foreigners were unwelcome. The European trading powers, Dutch, English, French, concentrated their attention on the wealthier coastal areas of Indonesia, India, and the coastal cities of China. Cambodia, inland, off the trade routes, was for 2 centuries simply ignored. Angkor itself was not. The Khmer continued to visit it. The Theravada monks continued to live in it. The local villagers continued to know perfectly well that the great stone city in the forest used to belong to their ancestors. But the world outside Cambodia did not know. The world outside Cambodia had, in effect, forgotten. In the 1850s, France begins to expand its imperial presence in Indochina. The French interest is partly strategic. They want a Pacific naval base to counter British expansion in India and China. It is partly commercial. They believe the Mekong River may offer a navigable trade route into the rich tea-producing provinces of southern China. It is partly religious. French Catholic missions are increasingly active in the region, having been recently expelled from Vietnam by the Nguyen emperors. In 1858, the French Navy bombards the Vietnamese port of Touraine, modern Da Nang, beginning what will become the long French colonial project in Vietnam. Within a few years, French forces have occupied southern Vietnam and are pressing inland toward Cambodia. Henri Mouhot is not technically a French agent. He is a Swiss-born naturalist, born in Montbéliard, in the French-speaking Jura Mountains in 1826. He has, in his youth, worked variously as a Greek and Russian language tutor, as an editor of natural history journals, and as a private traveling companion for wealthy English families on grand tour expeditions in continental Europe. In the late 1850s, having returned to England and become engaged to an Englishwoman, he proposes a long natural history expedition to mainland Southeast Asia. He is funded, in the end, by the Royal Geographical Society in London and the Zoological Society, British scientific institutions interested in collecting biological specimens from regions European naturalists had not yet systematically explored. He arrives in Bangkok in 1858. He makes several long expeditions into the Thai interior, collecting specimens of insects, birds, and the occasional reptile. He sends regular shipments back to London. In 1859, he crosses into Cambodia on the recommendation of local missionaries who have told him that the eastern jungles are rich in unstudied species. In January of 1860, he arrives at the small Cambodian town of Battambang, about 140 kilometers southwest of Angkor. He is told by local Theravada Buddhist monks that several days' march to the east, in the dense jungle north of the Tongla Sap, are some very old ruins. The monks describe a stone temple, a great moat, and several smaller temples scattered through the forest. Mouhot is, he writes later, moderately interested. His real interest is butterflies, but he agrees to go. He spends 3 weeks at Angkor. He sees Angkor Wat first. He arrives at the western gate of the moat at midday on the 22nd of January, 1860. The water of the moat is full of lotus flowers. The 5 lotus bud towers rise above the green of the jungle. The bas-reliefs of the outer gallery, The 800 meters of carved sandstone are partly visible behind a curtain of strangler fig roots. Mouhot stops. He writes in his journal that evening, unable for some moments to speak. He spends 3 days at Angkor Wat alone. He climbs the central tower, the same tower that Jayavarman's body had been interred beneath 7 centuries earlier. He copies inscriptions he cannot read. He measures the moat with a Cambodian fishing line, 200 meters wide, exactly, on each side, as he confirms by repeating the measurement at 3 different points. He sketches the silhouette of the 5 towers from a dozen angles. He sits, in the late afternoon, on the steps of the western entrance, watching the swallows wheel around the towers as the light fades. Then he walks 2 kilometers north to the Bayon. The Bayon, in 1860, is significantly more overgrown than Angkor Wat. The 216 smiling stone faces of Avalokiteshvara are partly hidden by vegetation. The lower bas-reliefs, the scenes of Khmer daily life, the market and the cockfight and the naval battle, are buried under a meter of jungle leaf litter, accumulated over centuries. Mouhot does not, at first, understand what he is looking at. He thinks the faces are some kind of decorative motif repeated on every tower. It is only after he has walked through the temple twice and consulted with his Cambodian guides, who tell him that every tower has the same face, Master, the face of the Buddha King, that he realizes that every face is the same face, and that they are all looking outward in 4 directions at once. He writes in his journal that night, "These are no longer mere buildings. These are the work of a people of whom we know nothing, who built on a scale not surpassed by Greece or Rome, and who have left us, as their entire signature, only these stones." He spends the next 10 days walking through the surrounding ruins. He finds Ta Prohm, the temple that Jayavarman VII had built for his mother, where the strangler fig trees had by 1860 grown directly through the stone walls, fusing the temple and the jungle into a single sculptural mass. The roots of one particular tree had wrapped themselves around a stone doorway in such a way that the tree appeared to be eating the temple. Very slowly, over the course of centuries, he finds Banti Gedi, the smaller Bayon period temple to the east, almost entirely intact, with a community of Theravada monks living quietly in its outer courtyards. He finds Pri Rup, the brick pyramid temple from the 10th century, climbing nearly 40 meters above the surrounding forest, with views from the summit out to the misty silhouette of Tom Nam Ba Keng several kilometers to the west. He finds dozens of smaller temples, most of them unnamed, most of them with their inner sanctuaries already collapsed. The carved sandstone blocks lying tumbled in the forest leaf litter. He sketches what he can. He writes about what he sees. He records in his notebooks the sentence that, 3 years later, will set the European reading public on fire, grander than anything left to us by Greece or Rome, and built by a race now sunk into barbarism. He was wrong about the second half. The Khmer were never gone. The modern country of Cambodia is them. Their language is one of the oldest written languages still spoken anywhere on earth. But the empire was gone, and it was Mouhot, more than any other single Westerner, who told the European world that it had ever existed. Mouhot does not live to see his discovery published. He leaves Angkor in late January of 1861. He continues his expedition northward through what is today northern Cambodia and into Laos. He travels overland to the small Laotian town of Luang Prabang. He pushes further north into the remote highlands above Luang Prabang, collecting beetles and birds. In November of 1861, in the small Laotian town of Naphon, near the Mekong, he contracts cerebral malaria. He dies on the 10th of November. He is 35 years old. His Cambodian guides, the same Khmer woodcutters who had led him to Angkor 22 months earlier, who had stayed with him through the entire expedition, bury him by the side of a river. They build a small wooden marker over the grave. They send word back through the missionary network to the nearest French outpost. His brother Charles retrieves his journals and his sketches and his collected specimens from the missionary station at Bangkok 8 months later. He carries them back to France. In 1863, he arranges for the publication of Henri's journals posthumously in a book called Travels in the Central Parts of Indochina, Siam, Cambodia, and Laos. The book is a sensation. For the first time, the educated public of Europe sees what Mouhot saw: the towers, the moats, the bas-reliefs, the smiling stone faces. The sketches are reproduced in newspapers across France, Britain, Germany, the United States, and even Russia. Within 5 years, Angkor has become a word in English, French, German, and Russian. Within 10 years, hundreds of Western travelers, French colonial officers, British adventurers, German archaeologists, American journalists have made the long journey upriver from Saigon to see the ruins for themselves. Within a decade of Mouhot's death, the French government, by then in active colonization of Indochina, sends its first official archaeological mission to Angkor. In 1898, the École Française du Extrême-Orient is founded specifically to study and conserve the ruins of Indochina. By 1920, the conservation effort at Angkor employs hundreds of Cambodian craftsmen, dozens of French scholars and architects, 3 full-time epigraphers translating Sanskrit inscriptions, and a small team of botanists working specifically on the controlled removal of strangler fig vegetation from the stone walls. The strangler figs are slowly cut back. The bas-reliefs are slowly uncovered. The Sanskrit inscriptions are slowly translated by a generation of French and Cambodian scholars who, beginning in the 1890s, finally reconstruct the long-lost chronology of the Khmer Empire. The faces of Jayavarman VII slowly emerge again from the jungle. The 20th century is not kind to Cambodia. The French colonial period ends in 1953 with the independence of Cambodia under King Norodom Sihanouk. The country tries to walk a neutral path between the Cold War's powers, but the Vietnam War spills across its borders in the late 1960s. American B-52 bombers carry out a 4-year campaign in the eastern provinces, ostensibly targeting Viet Cong supply routes, in practice killing perhaps 100,000 Cambodian civilians. In 1975, the Khmer Rouge, a radical agrarian Maoist movement that has grown out of the chaos of the war, takes power. They are obsessed with a particular reading of Khmer history. They want to return Cambodia to what they imagine to be its agrarian golden age, the era of the Great Berets, the era when 10 million peasants worked the land under the gaze of a single god king. They believe they can rebuild that empire by erasing everything that has happened since 1431. In 4 years, they kill nearly 2 million Cambodians, about a quarter of the country's population. They kill the educated, the foreign-trained, the urban, the multilingual, the religious. They kill the doctors. They kill the teachers. They kill the engineers. They kill the monks. They kill anyone who wears glasses, on the grounds that wearing glasses suggests literacy. The temples of Angkor survived this period, paradoxically, almost untouched. The Khmer Rouge regards them as sacred symbols of the imagined agrarian past. They do not destroy the temples. They do not even significantly damage them. But the people who could have continued the work of translating the inscriptions, of decoding the political history of the empire, of carrying the tradition of Cambodian scholarship forward into the modern era, most of them do not survive. Cambodia is liberated by a Vietnamese invasion in 1979. The country spends the next 20 years rebuilding. A UN-supervised peace agreement is signed in 1991. Free elections follow in 1993. Foreign archaeological missions return to Angkor in the mid-90s. In 1992, Angkor is declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The conservation effort, suspended for nearly 20 years, resumes. And today, every year, more than 2 million visitors come to Angkor. They walk the same causeway that Chinese diplomats once walked. They climb the same steep stone stairs that Jayavarman himself once climbed. They stand at the base of the central tower, the symbolic peak of Mount Meru, and they look up. The faces of Jayavarman VII still look outward in 4 directions. The moats still hold water in the monsoon. The jungle, after 800 years, is still patient. So tonight, before you drift to sleep, remember the Khmer Empire. Remember Jayavarman II on the cool slope of Mahendra Parvata, declaring himself the wheel-turning king of a country that did not yet quite exist. Remember Indravarman I ordering the first great beret to be dug in the dry months at Hariharalaya, with tens of thousands of farmers carrying bamboo baskets of earth year after year, until the lake was finished and the canals were running. Remember Yasovarman surveying his new city by the Tonle Sap, the canal stretching out in a perfect square, the first stones of Nam Bakang being lifted into place. Remember Suryavarman II watching the first lotus bud tower of Angkor Wat rising above the scaffolding, with 3,000 bullet carts of looted Cham bronze waiting at the gates of his treasury. Remember Jayavarman VII in his 50s, returning from exile to a sacked capital and beginning, patiently, to build a more compassionate empire. 102 hospitals, 121 rest houses, 2,000 kilometers of paved road, and 216 smiling stone faces of the Bodhisattva of compassion. Remember Zhou Daguan, the Chinese diplomat, in 1296, walking through Angkor with his stylus and his palm leaf notebook, recording the customs of a city he did not realize was beginning to die. Remember the cypress trees in the highlands of Vietnam, their rings recording, year by year, the slow failure of the monsoons in the long droughts of the 14th century. Remember Boromaracha, the Thai king of Ayutthaya, in 1431, marching on a city that had once been the largest in the world, and finding it half empty and taking it almost without a fight, with gunpowder weapons the Khmer had never seen before. Remember Kenryo Shimano, the Japanese pilgrim in 1632, walking 6 months overland from Burma to reach a temple he believed to be in northern India, and carving a Sanskrit inscription on the wall of Angkor Wat to record his joy at having arrived. Remember Henri Mouhot, the young Swiss naturalist, walking out of the jungle one afternoon in 1860 with 2 Khmer woodcutter guides, and finding himself looking at the moat of Angkor Wat, unable, for some moments, to speak. Remember the 800 meters of bas-relief in the corridors of Angkor Wat, where the gods and demons still pull, forever, on the long body of the cosmic serpent in the churning of the ocean of milk. Remember the 216 faces of the Bayan, still smiling in every direction after 800 years. Remember the jungle, which was always patient. And remember that empires are not forgotten because they fail. They are forgotten because they stop being told. The lotus bud towers of Angkor Wat still rise above the rice paddies of Cambodia. The 4-faced gates of Angkor Thom still look outward in 4 directions. The moats still hold water in the monsoon. 2 million people every year walk the same causeway that Brahmin priests once walked. The empire is gone, but the temples are still there. And the jungle, after 800 years, has finally settled into a kind of peace with the stones. Stay a while.